This is the third in a series of videos that I'm doing on sacrifices. Today we'll be talking about the Wellbeing Offering, also referred to as the Peace Offering. The Wellbeing Offering held a significant place in ancient Israelite worship, characterized by its unique function as a sacred feast shared between God and the people. Unlike sacrifices solely focused on atonement, the well-being offering facilitated communion and fellowship with God at the sanctuary. Sometimes these offerings might even be translated as fellowship or communion offerings. This type of sacrifice was unique because the laity could eat from it, which was not the case for the atoning sacrifices. The peace offering, like other animal sacrifices, involves a distinction in how different portions are to be treated. The portion of the peace offering intended for human consumption is boiled, because this was the general manner in which sacrificial meat was prepared for eating by people. The description of the offerings when the tabernacle was at Shiloh is a good place to look as to how the meat should have been boiled. But Eli's sons wanted roasted meat instead of boiled meat. Therefore, they took the meat to roast it themselves instead of letting the meat be roasted on the altar to God. And the people complained to Eli's sons and said this should not be. In contrast to the way that Eli's sons wanted to roast the meat, the portion of the peace offering designated for God was not roasted in the way that humans roast meat, but rather at suet or fat, and certain organs were burned on the altar. This act of burning was a symbolic offering, with the smoke ascending to God as a food gift, a pleasing aroma to God. Remember that sacrificial blood belongs to the Lord, but is never to be burned. It is rubbed on the altar, and then the rest of the blood is poured out of the base of the altar. No one is to eat the blood, for the life is in the blood. All the fat is the Lord's, though, and is used as a food gift for Yahweh when it is burned on his altar. This ritual difference brings forth a theological distinction, helping the people to realize that there is an essential difference that separates humans from their God. This realization comes through these distinct modes of ritual cooking. God's portion is burned through direct contact with the fire on the altar, whereas the human portion requires mediating objects like a boiling pot and water. The distinction between boiling for human consumption and burning for God is so significant that even the Passover, which was originally roasted, was later mandated to be boiled once it was incorporated into the sacrificial system. There are good reasons for the difference between roasting originally and boiling later, but I want to save those reasons for when we get to look specifically at what was happening in the Passover. The peace offering follows this established pattern. The communal aspect is facilitated by boiling the meat for the participants, while the offering to God is made through the symbolic act of burning select portions on the altar, signifying a gift and maintaining the ritual aspect between the divine and the human. The well-being offering served multiple purposes and occasions. Most of the burnt offerings and all of the well-being peace offerings are non-atoning sacrifices. These offerings were brought voluntarily, stemming solely from the offerer's initiative. They marked significant beginnings and were often reserved for royal or national celebrations to dedicate or commemorate certain aspects of life. Moreover, the well-being offering was an umbrella category encompassing three distinct sacrifices: thanksgiving, free will, and vowed offerings. Each subcategory was distinguished by its occasion, the expiration date of the meat, and the presence or absence of unleavened bread. The Thanksgiving offering, given in celebration of a prior act of divine deliverance, this could be in response to overcoming a dangerous situation such as a safe return from a sea voyage or a desert journey, recovery from illness, or release from prison. This Thanksgiving offering requires unleavened cakes mixed with oil and unleavened wafers smeared with oil as part of the sacrifice. It also has a one-day expiration date. Any leftovers had to be burned before the next morning. The free will offering and the vowed offering both are considered voluntary and share the characteristic of not requiring unleavened bread and having a 2-day expiration date for the consumption of their meat, with the leftovers being burned on the third day. The free will offering is a spontaneous offering expressing the worship's joyous sentiment. A vowed offering, however, is brought if the conditions of a vow are met. The offerer makes a vow to God, stating that if a specific event happens, then they will offer a well-being offering in gratitude for God bringing those conditions to pass. Remember how Absalom had asked his father, King David, about going out to offer a sacrifice in fulfillment of his vow. On the other hand, a free will offering is spontaneous, and brought due to the voluntary desire of the worshiper to offer his joyous sacrifice without any prior condition or obligation. It is purely spontaneous expression of joy and happiness. Whatever the cause, both are voluntary peace offerings with similar regulations regarding unleavened bread and the expiration of meat. The vowed offering is contingent on the fulfillment of a prior promise to God, creating an obligation upon fulfillment, whereas the free will offering is a completely spontaneous expression of the offerer's joy and desire to give. Why is there a time limit on when the food can be consumed? There are two reasons given by scholars. The first thing the scholars deal with is why there is a difference in terms of the expiration dates among the various peace offerings. The difference between a 1-day and a 2-day expiration have to deal with the level of sanctity. The Thanksgiving offering has the strictest expiration, requiring it to be eaten on the very day it was offered, and any leftovers had to be burned before the next morning. This 1-day limit points to a higher level of sanctity. It is also offered in response to a specific act of divine deliverance, suggesting a timely expression of gratitude. Remember that these sacrifices had to be made at the temple. Thus, the ritual does not demand that the offering be done in a specific time frame in relation to the act of divine deliverance. Instead, God, knowing that some people come from a far away distance, may not be able to make the journey right now. Therefore, God puts the quickness of the celebration into the meal itself. This will allow the person to signify timely expression even if the celebration happens a long time after the divine deliverance. Thus, the timely manner is put into the celebration itself instead of into the act of offering the sacrifice. Compare the time from the vow for Absalom, who waited 4 years before he fulfilled his vow with the offering. This timeliness in terms of the meal is also applied to the other peace offerings, but in the case of the vowed, the timeliness has been moved to 2 days, indicating a lower level of sanctity. The other aspect of the expiration of the food that scholars believe to be a part of the peace offering is that the food is to be shared. If there is food left over, then you may not have invited enough people to join you in your celebration. Thus, because there is a time limit on when the food is to be consumed, if you know that you're going to have so much food, then you have an inclination to invite people to come join you in the meal with you and with God. If we go back to Absalom's vow offering, we are told that 200 men from Jerusalem accompanied Absalom. They had been invited as guests. This would have been quite the celebration, especially if it had been consumed in 2 days. A 2-day celebration would also allow the offerer more flexibility in sharing the sacrifice with family and invited guests, giving the ability to have 2 kinds of invitations, one for a larger party and one for a smaller, more familiar party. Or it would give people more flexibility as to when they would come. Maybe they couldn't make it on one day, but they could make it on the next. The well-being offering is a specific ritual. The blood rite, like in the other offerings, is an important element in the well-being offering. The offerer had to be in a state of ritual purity to participate in the meal. As stated before, the animal's fat and certain organs were burned on the altar as a pleasing odor, and the blood was sprinkled on the altar. The parts for the Lord are brought by the offerer's own hands. The right thigh for the sacrifice of the well-being offering are given to the priest. Unlike other sacrifices, the well-being offering was not primarily about atonement, though the fat and certain other organs of the sacrifice were burned on the altar as a pleasing odor, and the blood was sprinkled on the altar. Nowhere do we hear of these acts as an atoning for any sin. While the blood ritual was significant, it served as a sign of the bond being ratified or renewed, rather than as a means of expiation. Instead, it was a way for the worshiper to commune or have fellowship with God at the sanctuary. Remember that the entire cultic system was about God dwelling with his people. If God were to dwell with his people, then it was expected that the people would fellowship with God. 3 times a year there were feasts where the people would make their way to the temple to partake in the festivals. The well-being offering was another way for people to fellowship with God outside these appointed festivals. The well-being offering served as a tangible expression of gratitude, celebration, and a shared bond between God and his people. Now, however, there is not a temple building. Instead, we are the temple of God. Jesus told us that the time was coming when people would worship in spirit and truth. No longer do we need to go to a specific location, to the place where God has caused his name to dwell. For now, God has caused his name to dwell in his people instead of in a building. Now, when we come together as the assembly of God, we fellowship with God. No longer do we need to offer a peace offering to commune with God. We now commune with God every day, for he lives in our hearts.